Violence against Asian Americans.
The disturbing surge of racist attacks against Asian Americans.
A wave of violence against elderly Asian Americans.
Violence against Asian Americans has erupted across the United States since the emergence of COVID-19. In 2020 alone, more than 2,800 incidents of hate targeting Asian Americans, ranging from verbal harassment to physical violence and even killing sprees, has been reported. Why is this happening? How is the Asian American community coping? And what is being done to address the issue? Discrimination, racism, and violence is not new to the Asian American community. As Asian Americans immigrated to the United States throughout the 1800s and 1900s, many white Americans began to worry about their job security. While white workers were busy unionizing and striking for higher wages, many business owners hired immigrant groups like the Chinese to replace white workers, maximize profits, and cut costs. This kind of competition for jobs between different groups created the fertile ground for the racial animus and hatred that would follow.
Each succession of each ethnic group that came in to serve the labor need, they came as strike busters. What happens is that it creates a competition and conflict between those that don't have power. Like, for example, Chinese folks that came to Chinatown, San Francisco, where we had Irish people that felt like they're better than Chinese folks because they're white and they should have a certain pay scale. But then you have these other Chinese folks that come in and they're more cheaper labor. When you do that, then you can create the rhetoric of, look at those folks, they're taking your jobs. So that's where you get the exclusion laws. That's where you get the justification of the fighting and the killing and the murder of Asian Americans.
The rise in tensions between white workers and Chinese immigrants caused what we call today Yellow Peril. In response to public outrage toward Chinese workers, the US government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. However, they didn't stop there. When we think of Asia, we typically think of East Asia and forget that places like India, the Asian Pacific, and Southwest Asia all encompass the continent.
The same thing happened in the 1900s. South Asian Americans, those from India, were working in lumber mills in the Northwest. In 1907, in Bellingham, Washington, a group of 500 white men drove out, beating a group of 200 Indian men, so that they actually left the state altogether. And there was something called the Dusky Peril, similar to the Yellow Peril, which then led to the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917. And that prevented most Asians, not only Chinese Americans, from coming to the United States.
Asian Americans have faced many challenges over the years that range from Yellow and Dusky Peril to Japanese American internment to racial violence and terror without justice. Yet it wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that Asian Americans began to receive acknowledgement and legal protection of their rights by the US government. This progress was due in large part to the groundwork laid by African American civil rights leaders.
We know in the 50s and 60s, they were engaged in the civil rights movement, which ultimately was successful in the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For most of the 20th century, it was only white Europeans who were allowed into the United States. And so they challenged those barriers and were able to get a change in the law that really resulted in many, I would say millions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders being able to come to the United States.
While progress has been made, it hasn't been a linear process. Right after 9/11, the US began to see an uptick in hate that was targeted primarily at South Asian and Muslim men.
The first 3 individuals who were killed in that backlash were all South Asian Americans. And that this also translated into policies which have profiled our community members, surveilled them.
And while some of these tensions were alleviated under the Obama administration, the legacy continues today.
I hear story every day. It could be your friends or friends' friends.
The most they'll do is they'll scream at me that I brought coronavirus.
People are just very open with their hatred.
My friend's parents, they have a shop or a restaurant or something, and it was vandalized.
Donald Trump is not helping out.
China virus. Kung flu, the Chinese virus. Kung flu, the Chinese flu, the China flu, the China. Kung flu. Kung flu.
We no longer really live a normal life. And I feel like even if I go to a shopping mall, or a restaurant, or elsewhere, I sense that. And I see in their eyes, I sense that. Is it racism? Yes, it is.
Trump's emboldening language has also brought to light misunderstandings around viruses in general.
We know that viruses are part of the human condition. We know that the so-called Spanish flu in the 1918 actually originated here in the United States. It's not helpful and in fact very harmful when any particular ethnic group or nationality is targeted for diseases that, crop up everywhere, essentially.
In fact, as new variants of COVID pop up in places like England, South Africa, and the United States, much of the blame and hateful speech continues to rest upon the shoulders of Asian Americans.
If you ask anybody, this has been happening for years.
I've experienced this years before even COVID happened.
It's just that nobody really covers it, and it's also because we don't really report, right?
Less than 1% probably gets reported.
People have always targeted our community because we don't speak English and because I think we carry cash and we're not people who make a lot of noise. At least that's the perception.
There's a lot of old ladies walking around. They don't speak English. People that are doing all this violence and thievery, they're getting away with it. They've been getting away with it until recently, until things have been caught on camera.
Whether or not you hate Asians, some of it is crimes of opportunity. Some of it is crimes of they hate Asians.
It still continues today. You saw how the former president poured gasoline all over COVID-19, and then it repeated the lineage of racism that's connected to those of the late 1800s. Right? So you see how the psyche and identity of and the perceptions of Asian Americans from that time and gets filtered over time as kind of the forever foreigner stereotype that if they're not American, then it's easy to exploit them because they're not American. They're disposable, just like Vincent Chin.
The violence, fear, and hatred directed toward Asian Americans has hit Chinatowns around the country particularly hard.
It's been drawing away businesses.
I've been avoiding places publicly mostly.
There's just a stigma of coming to Oakland Chinatown and all the violence that's been happening.
Running a business in Oakland Chinatown and to hear a customer fear to be out here and they're just rushing through to get grocery because they want to get out here quickly. It's sad to live that kind of fear.
I would say the best thing you can do is go to the Asian-owned businesses in your area and just go shopping.
Since 2020, we've seen the emergence of many community programs, from chaperoning senior Asians to patrolling and protecting Chinatowns around the nation. However, when it comes to law enforcement, not much can be done.
The vast majority of what has been reported to stop AAPI hate are hate incidents, not hate crimes. And the reason this is so important is because when we look at what the solutions are, they can't simply lie with law enforcement, because if 90 to 95% don't involve an underlying crime, just simply policing is not going to solve the problem. We know that racism actually is a stressor on the human body and causes problems like hypertension, increased heart attacks, even has some connection to diabetes. It's so important for all of these reasons that we fight against what's going on right now and develop these long-term solutions.
While we've come a long way from the days of Yellow Peril in the 1800s, it's clear we have a long way to go. Go to stopaapihate.org to report an incident or to learn more about how you can support ending hate against Asian Americans.